Hey guys! So today we are answering a subscriber question, and the question in question is, Frederick, what is a bidirectional dependency and how do we avoid them? So let's get into it. Well, bidirectional dependency, or as I like to call them, circular dependencies, is, well, the basic idea is that you have a file, and that file has a dependency to another file or another module, and the other module that we have has a dependency, and that dependency just happens to either be the first file or the first module, or a file somewhere in your file system that in turn is pointing back at that model. So basically you have something that points to, like, A points to B, and B points to C, and C points to A again. And that creates a circulation, which means that you can never, like, some languages can't actually resolve that. There might be other languages as well, I don't actually know that. But in, say, Node, they actually do, like, Node resolves this problem for you. Although you should avoid it as much as humanly possible. So that's the basic idea. I mean, the worst case scenario is if you have A and that points to B, and B points back to A again. So they're depending on each other, right? Now, depending on your language, let's say you did something in, say, Java. If you do something like that, it's going to try to, like, let's say you were trying to instantiate a class or something like that. What's going to happen is that when you start the program, you're basically going to allocate things until they actually you go out of memory and the entire program or your process crashes. So how to mitigate this? Well, the silly obvious answer here is to don't make A point to B and B point back to A. Like, you can't have that. You have to extract it somehow. You have to make those things not depend on each other explicitly, and that is easier said than done sometimes. I can give you, like, what I personally do if I'm faced with this sort of problem is that the one and, like, the best rule I can give you for avoiding this problem is to separate your concerns. This is something that I wish the JavaScript community, especially in React, that they would adopt more. Java has done this since forever, and I think it's a very good practice. It doesn't have to be extreme, like super strict, but the basic idea is that there is one file per concept. In other words, you don't have one file with multiple classes or multiple enumerations in a class, and then you have some functions, and, like, there's a one-to-one ratio between a file and a concept or an entity or whatever you want to call it, right? But in JavaScript land, there is a very common notion where you basically just have a bucket file, where you put in absolutely everything. The dumbest thing I absolutely loathe this idea of, I think in React they call it ducks, where, like, if you were in the React ecosystem, they use reduce, like, they put the reducer with all the actions and the events and, like, all that good stuff in the same file. The problem with that is that it is very, very, very common that leads to a bottleneck. And basically what happens is that it's almost always happens that you need maybe the actions, but you don't need the reducer, or you may need the reducer, but you don't need the events. Like, you basically just put a lot of stuff into the same file, and it's very easy for you to get in, without even noticing it, to get into this circular dependency or bidirectional dependency situation when you do this. You can actually there's tons of tools out there, guys, if you want to check if you're actually doing that in your own project, because the thing with JavaScript and Node and, like, CommonJS is that it's going to resolve it for you. And so you may think, oh, that's not a problem then. Well, it actually is a problem, not necessarily for you, but it can become a problem. If under the right circumstances, you can actually get production bugs from having these dependencies because the resolution is not going to work correctly. But you can go to Node's website and actually look at how this works and how that is actually resolved. They have a few very good examples so you can kind of understand what's going to happen. But the short answer is that you're going to get an object and there's not going to be anything in there. So you're trying to extract something and it's just going to be undefined. So try to avoid that as much as possible. And I think that the best solution for this problem is very similar to the same solution that you have for avoiding pulling absolutely everything in from an external library. And if you want references for, I mean, this is it should be standard practice. I really believe so. You can have a look at either Material UI or Lodash is probably my personal favorite when it comes to this, to seeing an illustration of this, where you think of your project or each module that you create or component or whatever you want to call it as a library where the index.js file or like there's some type of entry point into that single directory, and then you split all your concerns out into one separate file. So in Lodash's case is that you can actually import things two ways. You can either import the entire library, and that's one way of going. It's usually not what you want. So what they actually do is that they provide, as I said, this index file that imports all of their file, like all of these functions that you want to leverage into that one single thing. And then you also have one file per function or one file per other export, so that the consumer of your little library can actually decide that, okay, I want the entire library or I just want this specific file. If you have that structure, it's very often that you solve this problem where A points to B and B points to C and C points to A. If you're in the problem though, however, where A points to B and B points to A, like they directly reference each other, then you will need to really look at the logic in one of them and start to think, okay, what is it that I'm actually using from the other module, and see if you can move that out into a third dependency, and then they both can, then A can point to B and C can point to B instead of them pointing to each other. That's just the way that I solve this problem in general. So what I want you to take away from this is that a circular dependency or bidirectional dependency is basically just you're in one file, you're using some type of logic, and in order to execute on that logic, you need another file with stuff in it, and you try to you pull that in, but that file is already pulling in the file that you are working on. So the way to solve this is to separate your concerns as much as possible so that you don't have too much stuff going on in the same file. And if you do find that you actually have this dependency, try to really look at what you're actually using in that external file, because it might be the case that you can move that part into a third file, and that way you can resolve the dependency. Have a great day.